For over 6,000 years, human history has been shaped by the rise of cities. British historian Ben Wilson's enlightening and entertaining book, Metropolis, A History of the City, Humankind's Greatest Invention, is a thrilling tour of over 24 cities and thousands of years of urban innovations, from medieval Baghdad to Belle Epoque Paris and 21st century megacities Lagos and Karachi. In today's interview, Wilson discusses his ode to the world's greatest cities, the challenges they've faced, and how cities drive civilization forward. Wilson is joined in conversation by Robert Lewis, professor of urban planning and development at St. Louis University and director of the Community Planning Lab.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Bob Lewis. I'm a professor of urban planning and development at St. Louis University. On behalf of the St. Louis County Library and HEC Media, welcome to our conversation with Ben Wilson, author of Metropolis, A History of the City, Humankind's Greatest Invention. Ben, first of all, what's your background and motivation to write Metropolis?
Well, I've been a historian all my working life, author of several books, and I kind of got sort of brought to the city and urbanization because a lot of the subjects I studied involved cities, how cities worked. Lately in my career, I became more interested in patterns of global trade and exchange, and centered around very dynamic urban environments. Particularly, I'm thinking about in the 19th century with the growth of big American cities, growth of cities like Shanghai. And so all that research took me to the idea of a global city, or the idea of a metropolis that has a kind of almost disproportionate power in its own time and is able to connect across globes, across societies, draw people to it, tell us bigger pictures, bigger stories about the particular times that they thrive and flourish in. So I took that as a starting point for Metropolis. And the more I dug, the more it took me back to the origins of cities. And I find cities personally fascinating places. And part of me wonders what makes them tick. How do we kind of survive this kind of concrete jungle? Mm-hmm. I was looking for things that were specific about cities in their times, but also there's kind of universal stories that those cities, whether it was ancient Rome or ancient Baghdad or London in the 17th century or whatever city it happened to be, what story it told us more widely about urbanization, why we got there, what makes a successful city, why they can be, places of incredible growth and flourishing of ideas. Other times they go into periods of decline. So that's what I wanted to pick out in the book, was to tell this story that I think, has its origin 7,000 years ago, but each city in turn that I write about has a kind of has a general, a universal theme that we can sort of help inform our thinking about cities today.
Let's dwell a little bit further on Humankind's Greatest Invention. I remember as a kid listening to or watching the interview of the 2,000-year-old man. Mel Brooks was the 2,000-year-old man interviewed by Carl Reiner, and he said the man's greatest invention was Saran wrap. So why cities?
Well, Saran wrap probably has its origins in cities, in the sense that a lot of our great inventions probably do. And I sort of I think the idea of it being an invention goes back to the invention of the first city in Uruk, which is in Mesopotamia, southern Iraq. And a lot of the first cities, whether it's in Mesopotamia or in China or in Central America or in the Niger Delta or in the Indus Valley, all come out of these areas that support a lot of life, but they're shifting, volatile places. The building something that was permanent was an act of creating permanence in this shifting, volatile environment. So that's the commonality of this place that was kind of invented in a way to worship the deities that brought you all these great things from the marshes and to give them a home. And in ancient Mesopotamian thought, the city was a gift from the gods. The city was where the gods resided, and those few humans at that time, at the end of the Stone Age, who were able to settle in cities were literally living with their gods in an environment that the gods had created for them. But this invention, it is a human invention, of course, but it starts all other inventions. Uruk, this first city, is where the written word is first developed. The ideas of money, mathematics, the idea of living together, clustering together in urban communities, exchanging skills, ideas, and managing the complexity of density and living in this very alien environment for human beings brings forth this kind of inventiveness. So all other inventions, I think that was the point of my title, was all other inventions stem from the human minds being brought into proximity with other human minds and having to solve the unique problems that come from urbanization. So that happens in Uruk. These kind of within a few centuries, it becomes the managing complexity. You have a bureaucracy. You have people that have to store information in ways that information never had to be stored before. So that's why we get the written word, numerical systems. But it, like all other kind of inventive things, it's also it brings out the kind of worst kind of inventions as well. It's where slavery begins, kingship, all these things that are part and parcel, I think, of a complex society. You have the positives and you have the negatives, and the negatives being very obviously organized warfare and slavery. Some of the first people, whose names we know in history come from Uruk. One of them was an accountant, and the next three are a slave owner and two slaves. This is a highly complex and quite brutal and quite nasty society, but nonetheless one that is full of different kinds of inventions. The first work of of literature and human history comes from Uruk, the Epic of Gilgamesh, this story of a king going in search of immortality. It wrestles with a lot of ideas about urbanization. This sort of heroic figure feels himself very contained and stressed in a city, and does natural life exist outside the city? He goes partly on this quest to resolve that problem. His lesson that he learns is that immortality is written in tablets of clay, and they exist in the city, this legacy that's passed on from generation to generation. That's where immortality for Gilgamesh comes from. This is a very early, and this is remember, the earliest, the first city in human history, and this is a kind of that epic is almost a result of that complexity and that kind of complexity of thought that's brought in. And the idea, but the Metropolis, the title of my book, means mother city. It means transmitting that knowledge. Uruk becomes the sort of the seed head that kind of blows this idea of urbanization across the Fertile Crescent, the parts of the world where Uruk originated from. It's taken to the Mediterranean via the Phoenicians. It's transmitted to Greek culture. It spreads throughout the Mediterranean to places where there were no cities. People had no desire to live in cities. But once that idea kind of gets out there, it becomes the perfect place to sort of store power, bring about inventiveness, create trade and things like that. And then it was similarly brought to places that also had no kind of traditions of any kind of urbanization beyond a few forts. Like my own country, Britain was lacking in cities. It had agriculture and trade, but no cities. So cities were a kind of, in a sense, imposed upon them by a process of imperialism and military victory. So it is an invention. For a lot of places in the world, the city is imposed in some form or another, or the ideas germinate from a place like Uruk where it kind of begins. So I think, looking through history, moments of great creativity have come from urban environments, and often particular urban environments. I think of Athens, its golden age. It was a kind of higgledy-piggledy city where people were kind of thrust together. I think of kind of Socrates. He didn't go into the hallowed bits of the city. He went to the jumbled up immigrant parts of the city where he found clashes of ideas. People had come from throughout the Greek world who had a connection to Asia and places like that, spawning ideas. Or you think maybe of Amsterdam in the 17th century, another city of immigrants where people come together, and we find the beginnings of kind of modern capitalism in stock exchanges and money exchanges. You could think of a university as a mini city in a way, where people act together communally. They eat together, socialize together, study together. There's a mixture of formal and informal exchanges of information. All of those things are urban. And I think all of those ideas, whether it's the Italian Renaissance or whatever it is, or whether it's Silicon Valley, they come out of a kind of urban environment. So I think, cities are a necessary precondition for that kind of inventiveness, because it comes from its complexity and its constant mingling and clustering of people who share information. And that's how we evolve culturally, I think, is through that thing. And the city is the great accelerator in human history.
And cities, you point out time and again that there are also places of loneliness, anonymity, isolation, while at the same time being exciting places for collisions of ideas and inventions. If you could expand on that,
of course,
that contrast.
Yeah, because it is about contrasts, and it's, as you say, it's the highly competitive nature of cities within cities and cities against cities. That's kind of what brings forth a lot of invention. Yeah, and I wanted to sort of capture in this book this idea that cities are places of sensuality, enjoyment. They're places where people come together, bring food, bring entertainment, culture, all those kind of things make cities an enlivening place to be. I mean, this isn't simply a book about cities as cradles of power and inventiveness, that the city can bring people of different minds, different inclinations together to become places where you explore different things, like sexuality, for example. That's a big part of cities, to explore culture, to explore new ideas, whatever that might be. It is a great place where people can thrive, but it is, as you say, a daunting environment in which to survive. And so a lot of the book subsequently, especially subsequent parts of the book, are about how we've kind of negotiated, especially as they've become larger. And when they become large, they become complex. They often come cut off. Compact cities through most of history were in quite close communion with their countryside, with their hinterlands. Suddenly as cities become bigger, you cut people off, and you do become kind of lost in this kind of urban environment.
I was intrigued of your coverage of what in Western Europe we call the Dark Ages.
Yeah,
and yet Middle Eastern cities, Muslim cities really seem to thrive, seem to become more luxurious places of invention, and then were thwarted by, as I think you put it, really initially by the Portuguese. What was going on? I mean, why weren't the Asian cities prepared for warfare, so to speak, when the bad people came along?
That's a good question.
Why were the Portuguese so angry?
Yeah. I mean, there was a collapse of urban Europe, certainly after the fall of Rome, Western Europe, let's say, and very few large cities left in Western Europe after the fall of Rome. And Rome itself dwindled to a very, very small town. And London was abandoned. The Roman city of London was a Saxon camp in what's now Covent Garden, but it must have been an eerie place, this kind of decaying Roman city. And all the Roman cities of Britain disappeared, and ones in France disappeared behind defensive walls. But one of the things that sort of motivated city building has been this trade in very particular types of commodities, as far as I can tell, which was a trade in spices and rare metals between Asia and Europe. And once that gets cut off, and it was cut off by the rise of Islam, then the generating force of cities, which was this long distance trade, however it was conducted, kind of fell away. And the things that built cities weirdly, we often don't think about it like this, but it could, well be that spice plays such an important role in the development of modern cities. This taste for food and luxuries is a great builder and creator of cities. And that goes right back to where I started talking about in Uruk in Mesopotamia. It's the same kind of foods and spices that are being moved long distances, and precious metals and high value, low volume commodities that are traded. Europe was cut off from this kind of the economic heartlands of the world partly by their belligerence towards Islam, but also Islam sort of seals off connection, these long distance trade routes that also motivated the Roman Empire. The great city after Rome and after Constantinople, by Byzantium and Constantinople, was Baghdad, which was by far the biggest city in the world. The Silk Roads by land and over these maritime routes that connected the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea, knitted together these incredibly cosmopolitan, rich cities that traded in spices and woods and porcelain, the luxury items. The markets of Baghdad were full of the most exotic kind of foods and spices that were bought from across the world. It was cheaper. There was a rage for Chinaware, mass-produced Chinese goods in 9th century Baghdad, which were bought by dhow, these small sailing ships from port cities in China, thousands of miles to Baghdad. This is the stories of Sinbad the Sailor, these kind of adventures on the high sea, long-distance traders. And they hopped from city to city, the like of which Europe did not know. They were cosmopolitan places. They were shaped by Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Zoroastrians. There was and Jews. There was a massive kind of intermixing of different cultures and trading things. They were cosmopolitan, open trading cities, and they far exceeded in size, wealth, complexity, cosmopolitanism, anything that was happening in Europe. And Europe was very cut off from this. So why were the Portuguese able to sort of go into this very stable, very rich, very wealthy, very urban territories in the nation and roll them over so easily. And it was based around a lot of crusading. I concentrate part of this story on the North German city of Lübeck, which is a achingly beautiful North German city on the Baltic. It's a lovely, lovely city. It was a walled city. It was started as a part of a process of crusade as German knights were pushing out the pagan Slavs. And it was set up almost to support the crusades, that to be a bourgeois, to be a member of a borg, which was a defensive independent town, was to be a free person in a time of feudalism. If you could live in a city, small, compact, defensive, massively rich, you were granted privileges and an autonomy of city buildings. And throughout Europe, there's a mix of these small city-states, essentially, that are either part of the Holy Roman Empire or have autonomy of themselves. So Lübeck was the founder member and leading member of a group of German cities called the Hanseatic League. And these small cities, Lübeck was never more than about 20,000 people. So the mayor of Lübeck could dictate terms to the King of England in a lot of cases because they controlled trade. They were small, powerful, they had a lot of military force. And because cities are very vulnerable to these big territorial empires, what do? They have to build up sailing ships of war. They have to build up defenses. They're in this constant jarring relationship with other cities, other territories in Europe. So they become highly mobilized, highly militarized, very technologically advanced in the arts of warfare, especially siege and counter siege. But also Europeans are motivated by a crusading zeal to go to the rest of the world. The Portuguese are a kind of classic example of this, sort of pushed out, very obscure, on the edge of Europe. They become an exploring, seafaring, trading nation. And Lisbon was a very, very cosmopolitan city with a big Jewish population that had links and connections around the world, very entrepreneurial. So to harness this kind of desire for trade and the wealth of the world with a kind of very militant, crusading, desire to take over the world and reconnect with what they saw as Christian kingdoms in the Indian Ocean. So by a sort of process of pushing down the African coast, they're able to go into the Indian Ocean and completely destroy some of these cities in a number of cases and take over their trading. So Malacca was the kind of the Singapore of the Middle Ages, this place that traded in Venetian ware, goods from China, from the Middle East, from Baghdad, from Central Asia, from India. There's this kind of big exchange area of people and goods. Portuguese were able to go there with a few nights really and destroy it. Similarly, with a number of big Indian emporium and trading centers, because they were so advanced and so aggressive in the arts of war, they weren't interested in the free trade that they found in the Indian Ocean. They wanted to monopolize it, because that's kind of what Europeans did, was to monopolize trade and build up power that way. So as I tell the story, a relatively small, obscure city, European city like Lisbon, becomes a great global city very quickly. And global in the sense that it's connected to the Americas, particularly Brazil. It's connected to Africa. It's connected to Asia. It's the first city that really connects on such a large scale all these trading routes, and has the power, has built up this power in this very kind of aggressive kind of European form of urbanization that confronts this very peaceful, open, cosmopolitan, free trading system in Asia. And it's a clash of civilizations, a clash of cultures, and a clash of different types of warfare. One, nurtured in the kind of competitive European urbanization of the Middle Ages, which is pitting itself against big territories like England or France or the Holy Roman Empire, against these kind of, cities that have been free trading that really can't stand up to it. And I think that's a fascinating story of a change in the balance, a shift in the center of gravity in the world, really, from one trading system that is sort of meets a kind of radically disruptive new system. And maybe we're going through that in the modern world, the kind of rise of cities that had been obscure. But these are the cities I was talking about in the Indian Ocean and China. There's sort of urban kind of strongholds being built up in Asia, which is again going back to the kind of pre-Columbian, pre-Portuguese kind of intrusion into those places, which I think is fascinating.
Does tolerance and making money, or tolerance and cosmopolitan, go together, and you'll put up with a lot of other people?
It's sort of, well, to tell that story, Lisbon went from being king of the world almost, it was sort of the central city. It didn't last for particularly long, it has to be said, because they expelled the Jewish population, and not just expelled them, but killed. It was a horrific time. They expelled the Muslim population and the Jewish population, two of the populations that had made it cosmopolitan and given it footholds and the desire to trade around the world. And where did a lot of those Jewish people go? They went to Amsterdam because it was tolerant, because it was a city that was just, as you said, it was founded on the principles of making money. And you can't make money if you're excluding people, it seems. Amsterdam went from being a kind of backwater fishing port and small trading port to being a colossus at a time when it was bringing in not just Jewish people, but religious refugees from all over Europe. And it was quite a remarkable and rare thing for a city to have such an open doors policy. I mean, Baghdad in the 9th century, which was such a sort of powerhouse, was also quite a cosmopolitan place. It drew people from a lot of places. It had a big Jewish population. It had a big Christian population as well. It had, Muslims from all over a very geographically dispersed place. But Amsterdam, it was an injection of new ideas, an injection of people who had been used to trading in Lisbon or Seville with wide parts of the world to Amsterdam, where they were allowed relative tolerance to do what they wanted as long as they kind of minded their own business, made money, and contributed to the life of the city. That kind of new life that comes into a city, that constant renewal of people that comes into a city is always a motor for change. And I think London takes on the mantle of Amsterdam by a mixture of war, violence, happenstance, but also because it does open its door to a lot of Huguenot refugees from France, escaping religious persecution in France. They've got a huge amount of skills. It was transformative for London in the 17th century. And London itself did have a kind of open door policy and a greater toleration than other cities. Bring that forward to other cities, a Chicago or a New York in the 19th century. It was this constant sort of turnover of people that makes cities quite vibrant. And it makes them very interesting as well. Most of the global world cities that are desirable and successful places to live now, like a Toronto or a New York or a London or an Amsterdam or Paris, have very high populations who are first generation immigrants, and even a higher proportion who have family connections that aren't. And that's not coincidental, I think. We build our lifestyle choices on where to live on cities that are interesting and exciting. And a lot of that's got to do with food. First generation immigrants, of course, bring their food with them. Food is a big builder of cities and a big builder of sociability in cities. All the good things that we like about cities come from novelty, especially in the kind of gastronomic sense that, we go to cities to eat. We go to cities because of their reputation with food. And a very cosmopolitan cities like a Toronto or a London, you can have whatever cuisine you want in the world. You can have a constant sort of taste of the novelties of the world. That has been a builder of cities. Happy and successful cities do have a high turnover. It makes them complex. It builds resentments in people. I don't want to just dwell on the good parts of cities. They have a light and a dark side, and immigration and things like that obviously brings its tensions and things like that. But cities are built on this tension. They're built on the kind of competitiveness. But it's built on the dark side as well as the good side. And, we should always remember the dark side of cities, but their productivity does come from a clash of opposites often. And that's what makes them loved and loathed, throughout history, now and in the past.
I was first exposed to that sort of cultural change as I got out of college and graduate school, and the Vietnam War ended, and we absorbed a lot of Vietnamese here in the United States and others from Southeast Asia. And then the next generation's coming along and they're saying, let's go eat Vietnamese or eat Thai food. And I'm thinking, what? We were enemies. But in fact, it's a huge market for that sort of thing, and you get used to that sort of thing. Let's close by, I can talk about food all for a long time, but the influence of people like George Haussmann, it reminds me of, and maybe it shouldn't, but of a Robert Moses in New York City, massively changing things. And is that still going on? And but a good thing or bad?
There's always this desire. What's this sort of alchemy? How can we create the perfect city? I think that's, how can we get rid of Babylon and create the kind of the city that's purged of its sin and bad and squalor and bad sides? So this kind of, what can we do? What's the magic thing? Haussmann in Paris is this example, just you tear down the medieval city and you open it up and you make it more geometrical and, sort of pull down all the kind of irrationality and put in a kind of rational thing. And it was kind of resented at the time as well for ripping the heart out of Paris, which is kind of ironic because we kind of love Paris. And I think that's what we've struggled with. And I think we're living through a time now when there's a lot of efforts around the world to create the perfect city. There's ideas of smart cities, of using digital technologies to sort of get rid of all the congestion and, irrationalities and the harsh edges of cities. I think that's fair enough. I mean, we should always dream, about what the future city will be, but that's not to say it doesn't come without its massive costs, which is, especially in the 20th century, which was ripping up communities that might have sort of looked squalid and out of control, but will have their kind of underlying kind of order and a sense of community. And breaking up those communities was a huge, in lots of contexts, whether it's the United States, the inner cities of the United States, or of Warsaw, or London, or Glasgow, or any kind of modern city. It didn't come, this kind of attempt to impose the future on people's lives did not come without a huge amount of trauma and unhappiness, and in some cases almost unbelievable trauma and horrific things of people being trapped in inner cities and being unable to construct their own communities anymore. And I think one of the sort of the good examples of a city that, we talked before about cities being in a constant state of metamorphosis is a city like Tokyo, which has been destroyed and renewed so many times in its history. But every time it's been rebuilt by its communities, and that's what gives a city like Tokyo a kind of texture, a sort of vibrancy from the community, because communities were allowed to sort of build back to the hyper-modern city. It was built incrementally from people. But that's not to say that planning wasn't important. It was just retrofitted amongst people's lives. And I think that's the problem that utopian thinkers, whether you're a Haussmann in Paris in the 19th century or a Robert Moses in New York in the 20th century, is that you know better than people's lives and you can impose this on top. And it's a mistake, I think, that's been repeatedly made in history. And it's a repeated urge we have. And it's almost like we don't trust what's going on in the city. I went to, researching this book, I went to Lagos in Nigeria. It's a very exciting city, and it's very entrepreneurial. It's massive. It grows at a phenomenal rate. It's very chaotic. There's very little infrastructure that the government can put in. I went to this place called Atiba Computer Village, which was started spontaneously on the streets by, they think, maybe by some former typewriter operators that went into the computer repair business. Now it's the biggest computer market in West Africa, just in these streets of, a crowded market. It sort of recalls urbanization that goes back millennia in a way.
Yeah, right.
And companies like Huawei, these big companies that try and go into the market, have to compete on the street with sort of self-taught people who are competing, hustling in the market, competing on prices. Amongst that chaos is this incredible underlying order, which is people have apprenticeships. There's a system of justice, courts, police. The Lagos government look at this and go, this makes us look like a third world country. It makes us look bad, right? It makes us look chaotic. So what, it fulfills the stereotypes in an African city. We don't want that. We want to look more like Dubai or Shanghai. So they want to uproot this thing from the streets, which has a turnover of billions of dollars a year, by the way. It's not a small thing, but it doesn't look like it. It looks, messy. They want to put it in an out-of-town business park. That's a sort of microcosm of urban history there, in a way, that you can very easily kill the things that produce energy and excitement in a city by trying to regularize it. That kind of energy is really easily killed by insensitive planning. I think Los Angeles is a really good example, modern example of how there's the way that planning can respond to what people want. And that's as Los Angeles becomes more majority Latino, it changes the character of the city, right? Right. Latino people want a more public, outdoor, less car-based, private, home-based thing. And it's only recently that Los Angeles has legalized some of the things that have made it a much more exciting city in a way.
Sure. Yeah.
By legalizing street selling and open air markets and open air, eating back to food, right? Mm-hmm. Right. And it's by planners not trying to fight that. It's by planners kind of going, oh, actually, this is making the city better. We can maybe respond to it rather than try and plan it. Or you can look at Medellin in Colombia, where by putting in a few interventions, like connecting the kind of favela, the slum kind of areas of the city, to the central city through cable cars or escalators, and bringing public art and things like that into very benighted areas, you can actually give communities the tools to make their places nice.
I think we'll close it up. I hope those who are paying attention here realize your passion. It's astounding. It's not only in the way you speak about cities and their history and their evolution, but it's in the book. You read the book and you're captured because the passion is there. It's great storytelling as well. I want to remind everybody that signed copies of your book here in St. Louis are available at Left Bank Books in the central west end of the city. So we're excited about all that. I buy a lot of books at Left Bank Books. And I want to thank you for taking all this time and exposing us to the Metropolis. It's
been a huge pleasure. Thank you very much.
Invention. This is marvelous. Thank you very much.
No, it's been a pleasure.